All right. Morning. I appreciate so much the ability to come and stand before a group of faithful followers of Christ in the house of our Lord and talk to you about something that is so important and so relevant and so deeply rooted in our Christian values. It's critical, I think, as we understand and we take perspective on these issues to really reflect upon what God calls us in all of this. And that has been, by and large, not only my biggest personal challenge, but also the biggest challenge that I see of the faith-based community around the country is, what do we do? You've put in my heart a passion, you've put a broken sense of how deep this problem goes in our society, and what do we do as Christians, what do we do as men, what do we do as people in our family about this particular problem. And so today, what I want to do is, I can't possibly answer that for you here. Only Christ can answer where He wants you particularly to go and how He's going to use that passion to direct you to serve as He has designed each and every one of us to serve. Your service is different than mine. Right now, I get to do things like find missing kids. Last night, we pulled a 15-year-old girl with 2 kilos of meth, body packed on her off the border at the Hidalgo Bridge between Reynoso and McAllen, Texas. And I've been looking for her for about 4 days. She was taken from Minneapolis by a trafficker and taken to Mexico, and we were able to, through the use of some technology, determine where she was, and we were able to actually get her and recover her. So praises for that, right? And I know a number of you were praying about that, and I really, really appreciate that. One of the important things that I like to do when I travel around and I teach is I want to take pictures of the audience, because I'm getting old now and I forget where I was. So let's all raise our hands in praise. That's what I'm talking about right there. That's going to be my Facebook cover. My wife is getting so tired of me doing this kind of stuff. And that's my family over there. My daughter Michaela brought her new boyfriend Ben along. Everybody say hi to Ben. Hi, Ben. I promised her that I wouldn't do that, but I did. First boyfriend, 16 years old. And he's a good... How many chances am I going to have, you guys, right? And Ben is actually British, and so I made the little nav system on my phone the British voice today. So I just want to make him feel more comfortable in the car, and I think it worked. One of the things that we learn as we start to approach this issue of human trafficking, if we're paying attention to what those voices from that population among us that have survived some form of sexual trafficking trauma tell us, is we have to always be asking the question of whose reality we see. And if I were asking you today, what does trafficking look like? What does trafficking look like? Throw them out there. Prostitution, what else? One word's what? Vulnerability. Pardon? Illegal detention. Abuse. Pain, coercion, restriction. A lot of us think about trafficking in the same way that the media has told us that trafficking looks like, right? It's hands bound in chains and ropes, women in basements chained to beds. That happens. I've worked cases where we've had young girls tied to beds in apartments in northeast Minneapolis, but it's exceedingly rare. And my concern is, if our model of what a trafficking victim looks like, or what a sexually exploited victim looks like, if this is what we see, we're missing the reality of what that massive population of people out there that are isolated, that are vulnerable, that are without the means, or have means but don't have the ability to access those for a variety of reasons. And so it's really important when we're talking about trafficking that we're talking about a reality that's reflected in the words of the victims themselves. There's a woman named Holly Smith who I've had the good pleasure of meeting. She's a survivor, and she wrote a book called Walking Prey. And in Holly's book, and in some of the blog articles that she writes after, she talks about how much of what we use today as public service messages and messages intended to get out and reach that victim that's maybe in that truck stop bathroom or in that hotel room or something, that at a 14-year-old kid being trafficked, that wouldn't have resonated with her because she didn't even see herself as a victim. So when we put up images of people in chains, and we put up images of people taken off the streets of any town, USA, and forced against their will into a hotel room or on the back page or into the back seat of a car, we miss connecting with that experience of so many of our young women and men that have suffered like this. And that has been reflected so importantly and so clearly in the messages of these individuals that I've had the good pleasure and good blessing to talk to. If I approach these young people in Hennepin County or Dakota County or Washington County JDC, and I approach them as a victim and try and hand them that identity, I've already lost most of them because they don't see themselves as a victim. They may not understand the full dimensions of what happened to them. They certainly don't. They certainly don't understand things about vulnerability and all the other things, but it's important that we always keep in perspective that history of experiences that goes into creating who our victims of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation are today. And they're not just women. Even though the vast majority of the cases I've worked and the vast majority of those cases being worked around the country are what we call domestic minor sex trafficking, that has much more to do politically and with the ease of detection than it does with the actual scope of the problem. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. If we're focused on bars and we're focused on imprisonment, we lose sight of all of those other forms that don't look like bars through which victims are controlled, through which they're recruited, coerced, put in a position to even feel like they did it. Like their trafficker, their boyfriend, he didn't want me to. Boy, if I had $1 for every time I had some young woman or man say, that's my girlfriend or my boyfriend. They don't want me to do this. They're trying to protect me. Okay? It's really important we keep that in mind. Money is an incredible influence, and I throw this out there because one of the most challenging, difficult, and frustrating parts of my job is taking a kid that's 15 years old and is used to having $1,200, $1,500 in their pocket that they made over the course of several days, and now you're going to try and convince them that money isn't worth anything to you because of what it cost you to make it, but I want you to work a job at McDonald's where you're going to make $7.50 an hour. That does not resonate with them, ladies and gentlemen. They can't connect with that. Why would I ever do that? And I've had a 15-year-old girl not that long ago at Hennepin County JDC say, I got addicted to the money. When I found out how easy it was, that money was the reason I kept doing it. And I've recovered that girl 5 times. I've chased her across 5 states, as far away as Tennessee. The last time I recovered her, she was doing car dates out of a Robbinsdale duplex while her trafficker, who she identified as her boyfriend, stood watch from the parking lot across the street. The other prison that we forget to identify is that prison of shame. That is the prison that prevents so many of the young victims and adult victims that are caught in sexual trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation from requesting and identifying and connecting with the people that are actually there to help them in the first place. And the problem for me is so much of what we do institutionally perpetuates this and encourages this. And I'm not talking about from a faith-based perspective. I'm talking about now as my job as law enforcement, as one of the first primary responders to this. This is where advocacy organizations are so valuable. There's a woman in the audience, Christy Collier, probably not going to be very happy that I called her out, but I'm going to do it. Christy, raise your hand just because I already identified you. Christy is our Safe Harbors regional navigator for the West Metro area. So Christy and I talk several times a week. Christy has an uncanny and innate and God-blessed ability to sit in front or across the table from a victim and make them feel like they are not defined by what happened to them. And it is so important that we create safe places in our institutions or in our judicial processes that reflect the reality of that they're not who, or they are not defined by what was done to them. And that is a really, really big issue for most of our victims. So there's a video here, and if it plays, it'll be great. I tested it earlier, and it played. Kelly, can you grab my mouse over there off the... Thank you. Sorry, you guys, there's occasionally technical issues we have to resolve here. Okay, I apologize, I'm not going to be able to play that video. If I can fire it up, I will show you. So basically what this video that I was going to show you is, it's a video that was taken that comes out of Washington, D.C., and it's of a pimp circle. And the whole point of me showing this to you is what the video demonstrates. What it shows is a young woman who's out on the streets, and it's not Madison Avenue, I can't remember what the track is in Washington, D.C., but she's out there working the streets, and she's what they call a renegade. Has anybody heard that term before? Christy, I know you have. You and I have talked about this. What a renegade is in many of these larger cities, like Chicago, like New York City, like Washington, D.C., like L.A., most of the places like that where trafficking is pimp controlled, meaning that if you're going to be out on the street, you have to have a pimp. And if you don't, you're what's called a renegade. And then they do what's called a pimp circle, where they actually surround you and you have to choose. She can choose whoever she wants, but she can't choose none. That's not an option for her. And so the purpose of a pimp circle, and I apologize, again, we tested it. You were here. It worked before we started. The whole purpose of a pimp circle is to create that environment of you're not going anywhere. And if she resists, if she doesn't do what they say, they do what's called trunking. They throw her in a trunk and they keep her there for a couple of days and they drive her around. And so the reason I show that video is because that's an experience that unless you've been part of that world of sex trafficking, that very violent, very imprisoning, very coercive world like that, we're not going to be able to relate to that. And that is the type of background that most of our victims, whether they're juveniles or adults, are going to bring into that relationship with us. Party buses. I just worked a party bus case with Washington County. I would have never thought when I started this that party buses were a good forum for juvenile trafficking. But we charged Damon DiMartino out of Washington County. He had pimped out a number of women, including 2 juvenile girls, on party buses. And now he's sitting in jail, and I think his trial finally starts sometime in March. But when you see party buses and what they have down in the center of that party bus is a pole, just like you would see in a strip club or something like that, that's there for a reason. It's not there to hold up the roof, right? And talking to our young victims and the statements that we took in this particular case, one of them remembered being in that bus for a period of several hours, being naked the whole time, and him feeding her Molly and other drugs so that she would sit there and while she was there naked, dancing, and doing various sex acts and things like that with as many as 35 people that were on that bus at a time. There's no way for her to walk away from that situation on a moving bus, is there? That's a prison that we wouldn't normally see. Yet party buses, you can't drive downtown Minneapolis, St. Paul, probably Burnsville or some places around here on any weekend night without seeing party buses out there. You would not be able to tell by the smiles on these faces which one of these is a victim. You wouldn't be able to identify because of how it looks to us, because we connect that smile with, oh, they want to be there, right? This is where that relationship issue between what I did and me being accountable for it becomes such a touchy area for many of the young women that I deal with, because when they look at those photos, when they look at the fact that they went willingly to that hotel room, or that's my boyfriend, and he said, if you don't do a couple of dates off Backpage, I'm not going to be able to buy my baby diapers, and then I'm not going to be able to see him anymore. And that's all part of that coercion aspect. But it's important to remember that just because we see smiles on faces doesn't mean that that's not a trafficking scenario. I've had women that I've talked to where I would interview them and I would be laying out photos of these different guys, because one of the things that we do when we get an investigation, we'll work historically off of that phone number to be able to identify as many of the people that took advantage of, exploited, and sexually assaulted that woman as I can. So if we've got a 15 or 16 or 17-year-old girl that was on Backpage by the letter of the law, every man that came to that hotel room and paid for sex is guilty of a felony, regardless of how old they thought she was. That's just the way that our law works in this state. And so we're committed to working in that demographic, that group of men who responded to that ad. When we talk to these young girls, and I lay out photos, and we never have a problem identifying them, okay? It's generally about 85% we can identify within about 5 minutes. I lay out the photos, and I'm talking to this one young woman, and my wife actually spent some time with this young woman in an advocacy role, and I'm laying out all these photos of these guys that had sexually assaulted her, that had raped her, that had come to the hotel room, and she's like, yep, he did this. Yep, he did this. Just absolutely no affect whatsoever. None. This was just part of the life that she led. One of the important things that we have to remember about sex trafficking is that it involves a financial relationship that where people, like this man, have the ability to rent what they want, have the ability to take control of somebody's body, and get them to do whatever it is that they imagine their fantasy at that time to be. Because of that, it takes people and it turns them into a commodity. It commercializes that process of enslavement, right? And slavery is not a term that I throw around very much because I think that it's almost done more damage to our movement than it's done good. But I will tell you that when you start talking about the absolute fashion in which people are diminished to something that could be owned or rented even for a period of time, and this isn't just about prostitution and sex trafficking. This is about every form of commercial sexual exploitation, is it not? We don't have to look far to be able to see the examples of that in society. Places like the amateur porn industry, YouPorn, XXX videos, pimp.com, places I didn't know existed until about 3 years ago. And since that time, and one of the case studies I'm going to show you later on, is I'm going to give you a glimpse into a case that I did. It was a forced pornography / sex trafficking case. It was run entirely off the internet, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. These host ads that go on Craigslist, private models, these modeling ads. More and more I'm getting contacts from people that are legitimate agents of modeling where women are coming in, young women that are desperate, that want so badly to break into that world, and they see an ad that says, you come, if you're a model, we'll keep it private, I'll pay you $500 to take pictures of you, and guess what? They end up getting offered a drink, they wake up 8 hours later in a hotel room, they've been sexually assaulted, there's no money, the person that took the photos of them is gone. That's what's out there on Craigslist, and it's absolutely unbelievable the extent of it. We talked about Craigslist already. Social media has hit trafficking and sexual exploitation like an atom bomb. It absolutely has changed the whole face of this. The last 20 cases I've worked have all been solved because of Facebook. Everything that happened on those cases that was meaningful in terms of evidence, the communication, the recruitment, the identification, the manipulation of vulnerability, and in some cases, like the one I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes, the trafficking all occurred on social media. And it's really important to remember that because probably just about everybody in here, if you don't personally have a Facebook account, you know somebody that does. And who are the biggest users of Facebook and social media? Kids, right? Teenagers, and they're the most vulnerable. And so it's really important that we remember that. Another aspect that I like to make sure people understand about human trafficking and sex trafficking in particular is that it is a money-driven criminal enterprise. It is absolutely about one thing, and it's about money. If you take away the financial dimension from trafficking, you will not have a trafficker put a victim in a hotel room. If they're not going to make money, they're not going to do it. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells me as a cop one important thing, and that's an organized crime model. And it's good for me because I know how to do those. If a person is motivated by money, I can predict what they're going to do next. How do I do that? Because I look to what they've done in the past that's worked. Which is why if you have a trafficker, that's why these relationships with our young victims are so critically important. And people like Christy and Chersty and other people that work with survivors, it's so critically important that people understand In connecting with them, we're trying to get to their story. Because through those stories, I understand what traffickers are doing. And when I understand what they're doing and what they've done in the past, well, he recruits people off Facebook. He recruits people off of Twitter. He recruits people off of an ad on Craigslist. If that's worked before, they're going to do it again. Any good business person would. And that's why it's so critical that we understand this. The other thing that's important about money that we understand is you can, just like that wad of cash that I showed you in the slide earlier and the story that I related to you about that young woman, that is one of the greatest tools used by our traffickers to recruit new victims. And whether that's recruitment that they do themselves or through another victim, which is more and more becoming the preferred method of traffickers doing it. Okay, talk a little bit about human trafficking cases themselves and why they're unique. So I love working trafficking cases. I don't love it because of the content. I love it because of the challenge, and I love it because of the complexity, and I love it because of the blessing that God has given me to be able to actually go out and I think be able to help people that are trapped in a situation and draw them out. There's a couple of things about trafficking cases that make them very challenging. The first one is they're incredibly complex. A human trafficking investigation is more complex than the most difficult homicide case you'll ever have. The reason for that is because it touches so many areas of criminal activity, of evidence, of human behavior, and it generally speaking doesn't just involve one person. There's a dynamic of a relationship. There's a history with that relationship. Then there's, by and large, an unwillingness on the part of the victim or an inability on the part of the victim to be able to share that story with any kind of either understanding or recall or accuracy. Now, that's not to say that victims intentionally lie, but most victims intentionally lie. And why would they do that? Why would it be that I would pull a 16-year-old girl out of a hotel room, or Christy would call me on a Saturday night and say, hey, this girl got picked up at the gas station, she was with her trafficker, and this is her story. Why would it be that that kid who has just been exploited would lie to us about it? Why do you think? Fear, that's a good one. What else?
Addiction to money.
Money, shame. They lie because it's functional for them. They lie because lying has done something for them in the past. They lie because they've been taught to lie, which is why when I started doing these cases, do we have any prosecutors in the room? Okay, good, because I was going to talk smack about prosecutors for a second. When I started doing these cases, I was very frustrated because the prosecutors would go, oh, this was such a good case, and then we found out the victim lied to you. No kidding. They all lie, okay? Yes, they said that was their boyfriend. Yes, they said the bruises on their leg were from falling down, even though they look like injuries from being hit with a belt or a coat hanger or something like that. They lie because they're told to lie. Now, reason this through with me, because this has been my argument all over the country. You know, I take a 16-year-old or a 26-year-old woman, whatever age they are, and I recover them and I say, tell me what happened, and they lie. And they tell me the story that trafficker told them to tell them. And what did he say would happen if they didn't tell him? They were going to get beat up, right? Or they were going to get thrown in a closet, or they were going to get drugs withheld, or something was going to happen to their child, or their kid, or their dog, or their parents, or whatever, right? There's some consequence for not telling that lie. So now I meet them, and I take that statement, and they lie to me. And they say exactly what the trafficker told them. Doesn't that prove our case? Doesn't that prove the extent to which that trafficker has control of that individual? And when I talk about changing our script and our rhetoric on this whole thing, that's part of what I'm talking about, is developing these processes that institutionally reflect a centering on that victim's well-being. And part of that, like it or not, is understanding that just because we're here and we're ready to act on that victim's behalf doesn't mean that they're on board with it, and that's okay. It does not mean that they're any less of a victim. It actually means that they're more of a victim, doesn't it? If they can't even act in their own best interest at that time. So it's really important to keep that in mind. They require management of large amounts of evidence. This case that I'm going to tell you guys about, the first search warrant return that I got back from Facebook was 70,000 pages long. 70,000 pages of text messages. And I thought my daughter sent a lot of text messages, okay? 70,000 pages of communication between her and between the victim and the trafficker. They involve several investigative disciplines. We charged a guy out a couple of years ago that had, for 20 years, he's been a trafficker. This gentleman, I don't know why I just used the word gentleman. That's not the word that came to mind. Maybe it's that I'm in a church and I'm around all of you, and I don't want to use the real word that comes to my mind. We charged this guy out federally. He had, for 20 years, been trafficking, and everybody had tried to get this guy. The FBI tried to get this guy, and they couldn't. That's not a giant surprise. But anyways, I'm not going there because I've got a friend here with the FBI. But anyways, the FBI tried to get him. Homeland Security tried to get him. Minneapolis Police tried to get him. BCA tried to get him. The Colorado State Police tried to get this guy. Nobody could get this guy. So we started looking back at all of his criminal activity, and one thing that he did very frequently was he would beat up his girlfriends. So he had all of these different domestic assault cases against him, none of which were prosecuted, but he had a whole bunch of different orders for protection from all these different women. So we went through and we identified 10 different women over a period of 8 years, all of which had multiple orders for protection, multiple domestic assault. One woman had been brought into Hennepin County Medical Center with her teeth broken off. All of them identified, yeah, he beat me up. Yeah, he was drunk and he got mad. Guess what every single one of those was? You see it? Every single one of those was because they, as a trafficking victim, didn't do what he said. Either they didn't want to work that day, they didn't make enough money, they looked at another pimp, they didn't do something that they were told to do by him as a pimp. None of those were identified as a trafficking-related event. All of those were identified as a domestic assault. That is really important stuff. That's how they hide. That's why you can have a victim that's 36 years old, that's been trafficked since she was 15, and she's never been, nobody has ever connected that. And that can be with the same pimp or the same trafficker. Demand a high degree of technical proficiency. I don't even want to get into all that. I have to ask my daughters frequently, what's this, what's that, what's this texting app? It is what it is. That's the world we play in. And then finally, they have all these unique demands of corroboration. When we have a victim's story, right, we finally, we work with these kids or these adults, and they tell us a story. They're this big in the eyes of that case, right? Everything is on their shoulders. He did this, then he did this, then he did this, then he did this. My job is to make them that big so that they are not but one tiny piece of that whole criminal investigation, that whole case that we're going to use to put this person in jail. Now that's really, really important because think about what this victim is carrying with them when they come into that investigation and ultimately that prosecution of that individual and all of the baggage, all the traumatic things that they're carrying with them. Now they're going to have to sit across the room in a courtroom and they're going to have to tell their story in front of a person that just did all these horrible things and convince them, if you ever tell on me, I'm going to do something to hurt you, or I'm going to hurt your family, or whatever the threat was, right? So our objective is to make that story one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Guess what? That's pretty easy to do. It's pretty easy to do because of Facebook and cell phones and Backpage and other statements from people, and sometimes it's pretty easy to do because of the idiot traffickers themselves, because they say stupid things that they shouldn't say. I had a guy, and I took a slide off, but there was a gentleman that ran a brothel out of a South Minneapolis home for a period of 3 years. And Bernard was a 56-year-old guy. He was HIV positive, and he trafficked and targeted homeless, underage Native American girls. That was his standard operating procedure. That was his victim of choice because he would drive up and down Lake Street in his van and he would look for somebody that fit his demographic. She might be waiting on a street corner. She might be waiting, flagging down cars. She might be working for somebody, and he'd pull up next to him and he'd pick him up and he'd say, hey, do you want to get warm in my truck? Do you want something to eat? Do you need someplace to sleep? It's not safe out here. The police are around the corner. Do you want to get high? Whatever it took for him to do that. So Bernard, after one brave young woman told me the story about Bernard, and we were able to find out who he was. I actually followed and arrested the wrong person first. it wasn't really my fault, and it ends well because that wrong person was a child pornographer. So that's okay, right? That's divine providence. And God said, no, you're going to go after this guy, and then when you're done with this guy, then I'll give you the real guy, and that's what happened. But anyways, so we find him, we kick in his door, I walk around the neighborhood and I canvass, and 2 of one Oliver's neighbors are like, oh, we're so glad you're here, because he was a pimp, and his victims were these young Native American girls. And that's what all these people told us. But we didn't get any 911 calls on that. That's a whole nother conversation we're not going to have right now. But point being, Bernard Morris, when he was involved in his trafficking, he had a very, very specific way that he would do this. He would target specific people, and he had a specific group of men that he would bring into this. Well, the day that I arrested him, I did an 8-hour interview with him, and Bernard is sitting in my interview room, and he's like, no, I'm not a pimp. I just care about these girls. I just want to make sure they're safe. And yes, sometimes my friends come over, but I leave. I don't know what happens. And so anyways, I was really frustrated because I knew that Bernard was going to confess to me, right? And he didn't. And so my partner goes, you're really wrapped up in this thing. Just let him be the good guy. So I walked back in, and I said, you know what, Bernard? I misjudged you. You're a good guy. I apologize, but you're friends. Because he had this group of Asian men that he would bring over to his house that were his customers. And I said, you're friends. They're mistreating these girls. And he's like, oh, that's terrible. And I said, will you help me get your friends? And he's like, yeah. Well, he didn't really think it through. And so every one of those 8 guys that Bernard called and said, hey, I've got somebody new. Okay, now if I make that phone call, if I pick up my phone and go and call up whoever, hey, I've got somebody new that you can come to my house and have sex with, they're going to be like, what? Right? Not so with any of these calls. And so all these guys show up. What do you think each and every one of those guys did? They turned on Bernard, didn't they? Every one of them. Now, we couldn't use that phone call that Bernard made against him because he was acting as my agent. But whenever they were like, yeah, Bernard does this all the time and stuff. So that's just one way that these guys provide corroboration against themselves. Sorry, you guys, that got a little long-winded. I haven't had enough coffee today. I'm not going to lie about it. Gap work, okay? Gap work is that period of time between when we recover. I should take off that word rescue because we don't rescue anybody. God's the only person that rescues, right? Amen? And our investigation. There's a gap in there. That might be a minute, it might be an hour, it might be a year. That investigation may never come, okay? But I also want to tell you, if we never get here, that's okay, because this is not our primary objective. Our primary objective is this and their recovery. That's what's most important. Not me putting another notch in my pistol belt because I put another trafficker in jail. Those are good times. I like it. I like kicking indoors. I like putting handcuffs on people that I've been following for 6 months and listening to their phone calls and reading their text messages, and in some cases talking to them online on text pretending to be a 15-year-old girl. And I'm sorry for the creepy visual that now you guys have to live with there. But anyways, and I'll tell that story, Kayla, that I know you don't want me to tell, but I'm going to have to tell it. But anyways, I love that process of saying, hey, guess what? I know everything about you, and then putting handcuffs on them. But that is not our objective. God tells us that. The Bible tells us that the gospel is not about me making arrests. The gospel is about reconciliation, right? God reconciling us to himself and us reconciling with each other. That's what we learn. That's what we take out of the Bible. That gap has to be filled with something, because tomorrow I'll go out and I'll recover a girl. And then I'm going to call Christy, and she's going to need care. And somebody has to fill that gap between when we recover her and when that investigation begins. And during that, there's going to be tears, there's going to be anger, there's going to be pain, there's going to be runaways, there's going to be more chemical abuse potentially, and somebody needs to manage that. And guess what? I'm not the best one at it, okay? I'm not a social worker. I don't play one on TV. I don't pretend to know how to do it. When that phone rings at 3 a.m., and Christy knows what I'm talking about because she's smiling back there, and she says, I can't sleep with the lights off. I can't sleep in the dark because my trafficker used to take me to the bathroom and beat the hell out of me in the dark, and that's why I can't sleep anymore unless the lights are on. And they won't let me have the lights on in the group home, okay? You gotten those calls before, right, Christy? Somebody needs to manage that. And that's where this gap work comes in. This, by the way, folks, this is where the faith community fits in, okay? This is where we live, is right here. And it doesn't mean you have to have any special skills. It doesn't mean that you have to have an understanding that somebody else doesn't. It doesn't mean anything like that. All it means is we're going to do what Christ sent us out to do, and that's love your neighbor as yourselves. Right? If we did more of that, there'd be a lot less need for this in the first place. Here's an example. The other month ago, whenever I went to El Paso, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I come into work because I forgot stuff there like I always do, and then I jump on the light rail, and I go and I head down to the airport, and it's like 5 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning. There's 3 homeless kids sleeping on the light rail. 3 homeless teenagers. I never had thought about that before. There's homeless kids in Minneapolis that sleep on the light rail that just ride it. Why? Because it's warm. Okay? Coming out of the Bethlehem Pastors Conference a week or so ago, I come out, and as I'm walking through the Skyway, there's a woman who turned out to be ethnic African, homeless woman, sitting there in the Skyway because it's warm. Okay? Now, I'm not going to hide for a second the fact that I have a particular passion for people that are suffering in homelessness, and I think that we should all be doing something about that. Maybe you're not called to that. I totally get that. But I will tell you that if there is a population of people that are particularly vulnerable to the ravages of commercial sex, it is our homeless youth and homeless young adults in that kind of sweet spot between 14 and up, frankly, into their 30s. That's a population that tomorrow we could help. Okay? Right now, there's a change we could make. Victims, we've already talked about this, are incredibly complicated. I should take out the word potentially because they are going to be uncooperative. My daughter was laughing this morning because the worst beating I've ever had was at the hands of a 265-pound 12-year-old girl that I pulled out of bed with her trafficker. And that was a bad one. So a lot of trauma there, folks. I don't want to get triggered in front of anybody. They're distrusting, difficult to like. Boy, is that okay to say? Is it okay to say, I really have a hard time liking this kid because they spit on me, they swear at me, they call me names that even my own kids don't call me? I'm kidding, Killa. Yes, not only is it important, is it okay to say, it's important to say because we don't have to, nor are we expected to like everything about their behavior, but you better love them. Because if you don't, nothing is going to keep you on target when they start slapping you, or they start calling you names, or they start telling you lies. But one of the things we always forget to do is we forget to talk about that victims are brave, they're resourceful, they're experts in this landscape of human trafficking. One of the things that makes me insane is when I go to another jurisdiction and I find out that their manner for dealing with an investigation involving a victim, whether they're 14 or 34, is to say, tell me what happened, and then they go, okay, we'll take it from here. And then they never talk to them for 6 months. That's a problem. Part of our objective when we recover somebody or when we start working with someone that has a story to tell us is to drive a wedge between them and that trafficker, right? Because there's that compassionate trauma bond that trafficker is so good at manipulating where they are going to be questioning themselves. I've had victims like Bobby Larson, whose picture I showed you, that she just had a baby, by the way, and I recovered Bobby 5 different times back in 2012, and now she's married, she's got a baby that she just had, beautiful little boy, and she's doing very, very well. But up until last year, she was still telling me, 3 years later, she was still telling me, I still think about so-and-so. I still think back and I think, he wasn't so bad. Wasn't so bad. He beat the heck out of you. He locked you in a closet. He got you hooked on heroin. Right? But that's how a traumatized mind works. Trafficking is caused by vulnerabilities. I'm not going to spend a ton of time because I think I'm getting, is Valerie? Do you want me to? Okay, good. I just want to do this, and then I want to go through quick a case study for you guys. Big 3 risk factors that we connect with trafficking: chronic runaway behavior and absenting. There's that whole thing about homelessness, isolation. That picture in the beginning of the young woman sitting on a street corner kind of waiting, what's next, right? 15 years old, you hit the mean streets of North Minneapolis or Chicago, bless you, or wherever else you go, and all of a sudden, where are you going to sleep? Where are you going to stay? Especially if you're in Minnesota this time of year, right? Okay? You got to find some way to survive. History of sexual abuse or sexual assault in childhood. Boy, if there was a flashing red light that on this problem that we can almost 100% of the time connect to a vulnerability, it's this one right here. Traffickers are good at identifying that. And I don't understand fully the psychology of why that happens. I'm not a survivor in that sense myself, but I will tell you that about 99% of the victims I've worked with in 15 years have all had a history of sexual abuse or sexual assault in childhood. That is a huge risk factor. And then finally, this close relationship with somebody who's been involved in commercial sexual exploitation, and that's just that pimp using that as a means to get somebody in there, but also because a lot of my victims will tell me, you know what, I didn't know how else I was going to make it. I didn't know what I was going to do to make money. I didn't know I needed to get $500 or I needed to get $1,000 or I just needed to buy food and I didn't have any. I'm tired of being hungry. Little girl that we recovered off of a Backpage ad, many of you probably read about it, this last fall here in Cottage Grove, who had put her own ad on Backpage, naively thinking somebody told her, you just have to do massage or these guys will just sit with you and then they'll pay you money. And she's like, that sounds pretty good. And of course, it didn't turn out to be that way. This is the one where the guy showed up. I took over her identity and was texting with him. And I do other things, you guys, besides pretend to be a young girl on the internet, okay? There's other parts of my life. But he showed up with a trunk lined with a tarp after I said, hey, by the way, I'm 16 years old, which was her real age. And he was going to kill her, all right? And we got that guy. But somebody had told her this is the way to solve your problems. And that little girl, the only way she ate was if she went next door to the kindly older woman's house and got a peanut butter sandwich, and that's what she had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's all she had. And that's how this started for her. Isn't that somebody we can help? Isn't that somebody we can identify as a faith community? It doesn't have anything to do with trafficking. We don't have to be able to identify. You don't need to know the danger signs of trafficking to be able to help somebody that needs help. We don't need to be able to identify or know that they have all these 3 red flags and that somehow is connected to them being a trafficking survivor. We don't need to know that. We need to know that they need help, that God puts them in our path. The most effective time that I've had on this job has been the last 3 years. And that's because 3 years ago, something fundamentally changed for me. I was burnt out. I was ready to quit. I was going to go and work at Walmart. I thought that'd be a good job for some reason. Anyways, I was going to leave the department. And I thank God that he shined a light and wrote on my heart and said, you're not trusting me enough. And so I start every day now with, who's it going to be today? Who are you going to put in my way? And there's always somebody. It may not be a person I expect. The other day it was a homeless Ethiopian woman sitting in the Skyway. One time it was a couple of homeless kids underneath a bridge in Minneapolis. That has nothing to do with trafficking. And we aren't supposed to know that because that's not ours to choose, right? Trafficking timeline. I created this because cops are stupid and we have a hard time putting things in perspective. So when we go in to do an interview, and it's kind of the same for all of us, we focus on this moment of exploitation, that one day, that one Backpage ad, that one room. That's where we focus on, right? At the expense of everything else. That didn't happen in a vacuum, ladies and gentlemen. Try and get a police officer to understand that, because what they really want, and I'm as a cop, I'm telling you this, I'm owning this. We go in and we lay our badge and our credentials on the table and we say, hey, tell me what happened. And when they go, I don't want to talk about that, we got nowhere else to go. So this simple diagram was created to open cops' eyes to the fact that this is not just a person that has a single thing to tell you. There is a vulnerability. There's a period of recruitment and seduction and coercion and an introduction to this idea, all of which happened in their lives and all of which you should talk to them about, because if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to connect with this person and get to that story. Has anybody read Bill Hybels' Just Walk Across the Room? Love that book, right? All that book is about is making connections, building friendships. How do we get to a story, according to Bill Hybels? Through friendship, okay? Try and talk to a salty Williston deputy from North Dakota who looks like a scary North Dakota Scandinavian farm boy about sitting down across the table from a 15-year-old girl from Chicago and building a friendship with them, all right? But that's why that's important. I'm going to skip over some of this. Okay, you guys seen a Backpage ad before? Who here? I'm not going to ask who. For those of you that have not seen a Backpage ad, Backpage is the marketplace. That's where we live, okay? Backpage is the place where we find the majority of our victims. Backpage is certainly about 80% of this market share in terms of where people are trafficked online. And this is what a Backpage ad looks like. I just did some training with Source. Thank God for them. Jillian, raise your hand. Sorry, call you out. They're very passionate and have just a wonderful heart of Jesus to step into a place that is very dark and very difficult and very evil. And that's good because I want to step out of it. I don't want to be in there anymore. I don't think, as guys, we're supposed to be there as men. I don't think we're supposed to be on Backpage. And I'm not talking about as guys looking for a date. I'm talking about I don't think we're supposed to be in there in any sense because all of this, and the other presenters, the other panelists, I'm assuming are going to talk about this, but all of this connects back to purity. All of it, every piece of it. And in order for us to be able to do what we're called to do and protect those that are hurting, first of all, we got to clean up our own backyard, folks. And right now I'm talking to the men, but I'm also talking to the women. Did anybody see that Barna study that came out recently on pornography just a few days ago, where they're talking about the percentage of pastors and youth pastors that report using pornography regularly? I mean, the numbers are shocking. And it's something that as Christians, as people involved in the Church of Christ, we have to be paying attention to this, okay? And it's not just, and many people say, I don't look at pornography. I don't go on Backpage. I don't look for dates. I don't sexually exploit people. I would argue with you, and this is personal too, I'm not just pointing a finger at anybody. I would argue with you that when you pass a woman on the street and you crane your head around, that's a form of exploitation. Seems very simplistic, doesn't it? What does that say about my purity? That's where I'm hanging my hat right now, is that we need to, as men, be focused on our own purity before we can hope. And one of the ways we do that is by protecting ourselves from this. So thank God for the women like The Source, like Jillian, like other people that want to step into this world and reach out those hands. We have a role to play, guys. I just don't think it's looking at women in lingerie and stuff like that. You may know what catfishing is? Ever heard of it? Come on, you guys. Oh, you guys probably don't watch MTV, do you? So I don't either. I had asked my daughter, who's out of the room right now, what's catfishing? And she's, oh, Dad, you need to watch more MTV. No, I don't. So catfishing is to pretend you're somebody else that you're not, right? And then there's these guys, and they have a series, and they drive around, and they find out who people are, and that's what catfishing is. So a year ago, I get a phone call from somebody at Breaking Free, and they're like, hey, we got a 24-year-old woman here. Can you talk to her? Whoops. Can you talk to her because she's in trouble, and she's being forced to do pornography, and we don't know what to do. And I'm like, well, that's not really the kind of cases I work. I mainly work juveniles. You know, please, can you talk to her? She's desperate. So I go and I talk to her. Wonderful young woman. Desperation was an understatement for where she was at. She was really struggling to keep her 2 children fed, trying to be a good mom, and all this other stuff. Well, what happens is one day she gets a friend request from a woman named Bailey Ray. Never heard of Bailey Ray, doesn't know Bailey Ray, but guess what? Bailey Ray likes motorcycles. My victim likes motorcycles. Bailey Ray likes the Red Sox. My victim likes the Red Sox. They're fast friends. They never talk, they never meet, but they send a bunch of Facebook messengers, text messages, okay? And they're like telling each other about everything. And so eventually, one day, Bailey Ray sends my victim, we'll call her Audrey, sends Audrey a text message on Facebook, and it says, hey, here's a picture of me in my bra and underwear. I think it makes me look fat. What do you think? And Audrey's like, oh, no, that's so silly. You're beautiful. Oh, that's sweet. Now send me one of you. And Audrey, of course, protests. I don't want to do that. That's weird. Oh, come on. That's what friends do. So Audrey sends her a picture. And this happens a few more times over the course of the next month. And eventually the pictures go from being bra and underwear to being nude, right? But this is friendship. These are friends. You can get away with that. You can trust your friends. Bailey Ray, Audrey one day makes the disclosure, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm on Backpage because I don't know how else to make money for my kids. And I just wanted to tell you because I felt like it's been bugging me and I had to admit that to you. So Bailey Ray's like, oh, Don't worry about it. I think that's hot. And Audrey's like, oh, you're really a true friend. And then Bailey Ray says, send me a video of you with one of the guys. And she's like, that's really weird. Why would I do that? But Bailey Ray keeps on her. So Audrey sends her eventually a 30-second video clip of her performing oral sex on a guy that she met on Backpage, okay? And everything changes in this relationship. The next day she gets a friend request from Dante Maxwell, who she's also never met, and he said with a message that says, hey, I saw your video, that's really hot, send me more. So of course Audrey freaks out, contacts Bailey Ray, again on Facebook Messenger, and says, and she contacts her on Facebook Messenger and says, what'd you give him my video for? You know, that I trusted you, you're my friend. And Bailey Ray says, don't mess with this guy. Do what he says, he's dangerous, he'll ruin your life. And so she goes back and forth with this guy. Eventually, he starts sending her messages. Eventually, she sends him another video. He tells her he posted it online on xxvideos.com, which I actually recovered, by the way, and got taken off of there. And at one point, he says, you want me out of your life? Oh, the other thing he does, he says, if you don't send me more videos, I'm going to send this video that I have to all these people. And she sends her a screen capture of all of her friends list to include one of her kids' elementary school teachers and her parents and things like that. So this is where her desperation is beginning. So then what he says to her is, if you want me out of your life, you got to do one thing for me. You're going to go to the Hotel Minneapolis downtown, which, by the way, is the next block over from City Hall, just coincidentally. And you're going to have sex with these 4 guys, and a 5th guy is going to record it. And then I'll be out of your life. And so she doesn't want to do it. She protests, but eventually she does it, right? Is he out of her life? Absolutely not. He says, you didn't do what I told you. You didn't seem like you enjoyed it enough. You didn't smile. You didn't do all the positions I said. I mean, folks, this is probably the angriest that I've ever been in a case. My wife remembers that. I had to watch 2 hours worth of videos of this young woman being raped by 4 guys in a hotel room so that I could try and identify these guys and I could explain frame by frame what was happening to her. That's not normal for us to have to do that kind of crap, okay? So anyways, this is the moment where I come into her life, where she says, I can't do this anymore. So I start looking at this stuff, and I'm not going to draw this out very long, but long story short, I right away get suspicious of who Bailey Ray and Dante Maxwell are, because when I put up a pen register on Facebook, they're using exactly the same IP address. They're also not friends with each other, even though they say that they're together, and they're not talking to each other. That's really, really strange. Okay, why? I mean, you know, if you're friends with somebody and you each have Facebook accounts, generally speaking, you're talking to each other, but these guys weren't. So I start thinking, that's really odd. They can't be together, but when one's on one IP address, then the other's on that IP address and whatnot. This case lasts 4 months, 200 hours of overtime, 425 hours of surveillance, 17 undercover operations, 68 search warrants, 22 court orders, blah, 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 75,000 pages of discovery. Does everybody know what discovery is? That's what I have to turn into the court when we do it, all of our evidence. This was 75,000, by far the biggest discovery that I've ever done. 9 fake Facebook accounts, 18 unwilling co-conspirators, 35 identified victims. At the end of the day, what we found out, what I determined was Matt Bruss, who is a guy that lived in a group home in West St. Paul, it was a sober house, was Dante Maxwell and Bailey Ray. He was posing as both of them, and the day that I brought up his name to her, because they were both talking about on messages that they were messages that they were sending to people, they're both talking about him. And so I asked her, I go, who's Matt Bruss? She goes, oh, he's this weird guy. I dated him one time, and he was like stalking me, and it was just creepy, and so I changed my phone number and all this kind of stuff. Really, when did that happen? Oh, it happened like in April, so it happened like 2 months before all this kicked off with her. And so the light goes on. I'm kind of slow. I'm old, right? It took a little while, but I eventually figured it out. And Matt Bruss was Dante Maxwell and Bailey Ray. And this was something he had done to identify 35. There's probably more victims all over the country. That's Matt right there. He's now, he pled guilty. He's sitting in the can. I have a picture of his dog. This is a law enforcement thing, and the reason I do that is because he used his dog's name as his password on his Facebook accounts, and that's how I was able to penetrate him. And so I took over all of his Facebook accounts, which was really kind of cool. And actually, I use those in my stings today that we do. He built them, but I'm going to use them, right? Let's get some good out of this. And after we found out who he was and what he was doing, I bounced him all over the Twin Cities. That's those 17 undercover operations, and we were able to get video and evidence. And I also did a wiretap on his phone. And so anyways, my point being, you get some idea of what goes into this. But the more important piece of this is the absolute malice of this guy. So I asked him, after he confessed to everything, I'm sitting in Ramsey County Adult Detention Center, read him his Miranda, waived his right to an attorney, confessed to all of it, and I say, last question. I say, Matt, I don't think you're an evil person. I think you're a good guy. None of that is true. I lied. I think he's one of the most evil people I've ever met in my life, but I had to play that game with him. And so I said, I know she's going to want to know. Why? And he goes, I don't know, I guess I was bored. Try and make that one go down for the victim. Try and put some positive twist or some closure on that. I was bored, and so that's why you subjected her to these multiple sexual assaults and all this exploitation and all this other stuff. And the worst thing that he did was telling her that she hadn't smiled enough when she was making those videos. That sticks with me in a way that I can't even express. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll get out of the way because she's coming for me, is with regard to our homeless youth, this one popped up on a tip that came from a St. Thomas student that was looking for a place to stay, and she saw this ad. Homeless, had a fight with parents or boyfriend, need a place to stay, looking for female to help out, free rent, free ride, whatever. Whatever you need, 1 night or longer, you help me, I will help you. And she was worried about this enough, so I plugged in dude's phone number right here. See, I'm slipping into my cop lingo. Dude is an industry term we use. Anyways, I slipped this into our database, and sure enough, it comes back to a 50-year-old registered sex offender in North Minneapolis that had 2 prior kidnappings, both on juveniles, both at knife point, okay? So again, an example of where I took over as I texted this guy as a 15-year-old girl, and you can see second thing he says to me after hello, how old are you? Where? I'm 15, and then I had to cut out the rest of the stuff because then it gets really, really nasty. But I did this with this guy for 3 days. We exchanged somewhere around 200 text messages, and then eventually, this is when we put him in handcuffs down in Lakeville because he showed up to pick me up. That's the threat, and that threat is real, and we have to be aware of that, okay? And that's right out there, a free ad on Facebook. I'm sorry, not on Facebook, but on Backpage, so it's important that we remember all that. And then I promised this is just the stuff about that Barna Group pornography. Teens and young adults use porn more than anyone else. I'm not going to take any more time, but you cannot separate the effect of pornography on human trafficking. They're absolutely tied in, and I'm sure that the other panelists will talk about that. But that's why this is so shocking and alarming, because teens and young adults are using it. Look at that stat. Teens and young adults think not recycling is worse than viewing porn, 56% to 32%. That's a shocking finding, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I say when I'm saying let's clean up our own backyards on this, okay? Thanks, you guys.